Let me see that. Dispatch 2-3, can you run a credential check for an FBI badge, last name Willis? Stand by.
Take your time.
Stay right here, sir.
Not going anywhere.
It took 47 seconds. 47 seconds for a veteran patrol officer to transform an ordinary Wednesday morning into a moment that would define the rest of his career. 47 seconds to look at a black man walking through a corporate parking lot, see a federal identification badge hanging from his neck, and decide that something about this picture did not add up. 47 seconds to make a radio call that would be replayed thousands of times across the country, dissected by news anchors, debated by legal experts, and studied in police academies for years to come. The man he stopped was not just any federal employee. He was not some mid-level bureaucrat shuffling papers in a forgotten office. He was someone whose entire professional existence revolved around teaching law enforcement officers how to do their jobs correctly. And in those 47 seconds, everything that officer thought he knew about reading people, about trusting his instincts, about the nature of authority itself, would come crashing down around him. This is the story of what happens when assumption collides with reality, when prejudice meets professionalism, when a man in uniform confronts a man whose authority runs deeper than any badge. If you find yourself thinking about these issues, wondering how something like this could happen in modern America, I want you to stay with me until the end. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from today, because stories like this one connect people across borders, across experiences, across perspectives. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because tomorrow we have another story that will stay with you long after you finish watching. Let me take you to Fairview, Virginia. It is a suburb that sits in the shadow of the nation's capital, a place where government contractors and federal agencies have established satellite offices in sprawling corporate parks. The buildings here are unremarkable. Glass and steel structures surrounded by perfectly maintained landscaping, connected by winding roads with names like Innovation Drive and Enterprise Boulevard. During rush hour, these parking lots fill with vehicles carrying analysts, consultants, project managers, and the countless other professionals who keep the machinery of government functioning from behind the scenes. But on this particular Wednesday morning, at approximately 7:43, the lot outside Building 4 of the Meridian Corporate Center was nearly empty. The early autumn sun had just cleared the tree line to the east, casting long shadows across the asphalt. A light mist hung in the air from overnight rain, and the temperature hovered somewhere in the low 60s. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing extraordinary, the kind of morning that would blur into 1,000 other mornings in memory, forgotten almost as soon as it passed. Officer Derek Hawkins had been patrolling these corporate parks for almost 12 years. He knew every building, every lot, every shortcut between complexes. He knew which companies had early bird employees and which ones kept more casual hours. He knew where the security guards took their smoke breaks and which maintenance crews were legitimate. At 44 years old, with a wife, 2 teenage sons, and a mortgage on a split-level ranch house in a subdivision 15 minutes away, Hawkins considered himself a professional. He had never fired his weapon outside of training. He had never been involved in a serious use-of-force incident. His annual reviews consistently rated him as satisfactory, occasionally above average. But there was another pattern woven through Derek Hawkins's 12-year career, one that appeared in the margins of his personnel file, in the statistics that the department compiled but rarely examined closely. Over the past 8 years, Hawkins had initiated contact with African American individuals at a rate more than 3 times higher than his documented contacts with white individuals in the same areas. When adjusted for the demographic composition of the corporate parks he patrolled, the disparity became even more pronounced. Complaints had been filed, 5 to be exact. Each one had been investigated by internal affairs, and each one had been closed without disciplinary action, insufficient evidence, conflicting accounts, officer discretion within departmental guidelines. Derek Hawkins did not think of himself as a racist. He would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion. He had black colleagues he respected. He had once helped organize a youth basketball league in a predominantly African American neighborhood. He believed in fairness, in equal treatment, in the principles enshrined in the Constitution he had sworn to uphold. But somewhere in the wiring of his mind, connections had formed that he had never examined closely. Associations between certain appearances and certain threats. Reflexes that operated below the level of conscious thought. And on this Wednesday morning, those reflexes were about to encounter something they had never anticipated. The man walking across the parking lot was named Jerome Washington. He was 45 years old, though he could have passed for someone several years younger. His head was shaved clean, and he carried himself with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from decades of experience in high-pressure situations. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, well-fitted but not flashy, with a light blue dress shirt open at the collar. No tie today. He had learned long ago that a tie could be a liability in certain training scenarios, and old habits died hard. His black leather briefcase was worn at the corners from years of use, the kind of bag that accumulates its own history. And around his neck, suspended on a lanyard with red and blue stripes, hung an identification badge that bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jerome Washington had been with the Bureau for 22 years. He had started as a field agent in the Atlanta office, working organized crime cases that took him from the boardrooms of legitimate businesses to the back rooms of establishments that existed in a more ambiguous legal space. He had been shot at twice, stabbed once, and had talked more than one armed suspect into surrendering without violence. Somewhere along the way, his superiors had recognized that his greatest talent was not in pursuing criminals, but in shaping the officers who would. For the past 11 years, he had served as a senior instructor at the FBI's training facilities, traveling the country to conduct specialized sessions for federal and local law enforcement agencies. He had trained DEA agents, Secret Service personnel, U.S. Marshals, and countless police officers from departments large and small. Today's assignment was routine. A defense contractor with significant federal business had requested a security consultation and training session for their executive protection team. Jerome had driven up from Quantico the previous evening, spent the night at a hotel near the airport, and arrived at the Meridian Corporate Center early enough to review his materials before the 8:30 start time. He had parked his rental car, a silver mid-size sedan, in a spot near the building's main entrance. He had gathered his briefcase, checked his phone for any last-minute messages, and begun walking toward the glass doors that led to the lobby. He was thinking about the session ahead. The client had specifically requested focus on threat assessment and de-escalation techniques, topics that Jerome had been teaching for more than a decade. He was mentally reviewing the case studies he planned to use, the scenarios he would walk them through, the questions he anticipated from participants. His mind was fully occupied with professional matters, which is why it took him a moment to register the patrol car pulling diagonally across the parking lot behind him. The Fairview Police Department cruiser was a white Ford Explorer with the department's blue and gold insignia on the doors. Derek Hawkins brought it to a stop approximately 30 feet from where Jerome had parked, positioning the vehicle so that it partially blocked the rental car's path to the lot's exit. This was standard procedure for a field interview, something Hawkins had done hundreds of times before. It allowed the officer to maintain visual contact with both the subject and any vehicle that might be involved, while also creating a natural barrier that discouraged flight. Hawkins sat in his vehicle for a moment, watching Jerome through the windshield. The body camera mounted on his uniform had activated automatically when he shifted the cruiser into park, as it was designed to do. Its small lens captured everything from this point forward, the view through the glass, the instrument panel, and eventually, every word and gesture that would follow. In that moment, as Hawkins studied the man walking toward Building 4, a calculation was taking place in his mind. Not a conscious calculation, not something he could have articulated if asked, but a process nonetheless. African-American male, professional attire, federal ID visible. Early morning, nearly empty lot. Something did not fit. Something felt wrong. What was wrong, of course, was the calculation itself. But Derek Hawkins did not know that yet. He opened the door and stepped out of the cruiser, his boots making a soft sound on the still damp asphalt. The morning air was cool on his face, carrying the faint scent of wet grass from the landscaped areas bordering the lot. He rested his hand on his duty belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to be ready. This, too, was habit, muscle memory from 12 years of approaching unknown situations. He cleared his throat. Sir, I need you to stop right there." Jerome Washington halted in mid-stride. He turned slowly, deliberately, the way someone moves when they want to demonstrate that they pose no threat. His expression was neutral, curious perhaps, but showing no alarm. In his years of teaching law enforcement, he had emphasized the importance of reading body language, of recognizing the subtle signals that could indicate danger. Now, instinctively, he was controlling his own signals, presenting himself as exactly what he was, a professional with nothing to hide and no interest in confrontation. "Good morning, officer," Jerome said. His voice was calm, pitched at a conversational level, carrying just enough across the 30 feet that separated them. "Is there something I can help you with?" Hawkins walked closer, his pace measured, his eyes moving between Jerome's face and his hands. The FBI badge was clearly visible, the seal catching the morning light, but something in the officer's mind had already classified it as suspicious, not because it looked fake, because it did not. Not because Jerome's demeanor suggested deception, because it did not, but because the mental model Derek Hawkins carried in his head had no ready category for a black man with this kind of credential walking through this kind of space at this kind of hour. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Hawkins said when he had closed the distance to about 10 feet. "And I need you to tell me what you're doing here." Jerome lifted the badge that hung from his lanyard, holding it at an angle that made it easy to read. "I'm Jerome Washington, senior instructor with the FBI. I'm here for a training session at Grayson Defense Solutions in Building 4. My meeting starts at 8:30. He said this without defensiveness, without irritation, in the same tone he might use to give directions to someone who had asked politely. 22 years of federal service had taught him many things, and one of them was that the way you handled moments like this could determine how they ended. He had seen situations escalate from nothing into tragedy. He had seen reasonable people make unreasonable decisions under pressure. He had no intention of becoming a statistic, and he had no intention of giving this officer any excuse to view him as anything other than what he was. But Derek Hawkins was not ready to accept what he was seeing. He looked at the badge, looked at Jerome's face, looked at the badge again. The credential appeared genuine. The man's story was plausible. Everything about the situation should have signaled to Hawkins that this was a non-event, a simple case of a federal employee going about his business. Yet something kept nagging at him, some voice in the back of his mind whispering that this was not quite right. "You have any other identification?" Hawkins asked. "Driver's license?" "I do." Jerome reached slowly toward his inside jacket pocket, narrating his movements as he did so. "I'm reaching for my wallet. It's in my left inside pocket." This was another lesson he had taught countless times. Always tell an officer what you are doing before you do it. Never make sudden movements. Never give them a reason to feel threatened. He produced a black leather wallet, extracted his Virginia driver's license, and held it out along with the FBI badge. Hawkins took both documents, examining them in the gray morning light. The driver's license showed a Quantico address. The photograph matched the man standing in front of him. The FBI badge had all the markers of authenticity, the raised seal, the holographic elements, the proper formatting. On paper, everything checked out. In Derek Hawkins's gut, something still felt wrong. Think about this moment for a second. Here was a man who had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to federal law enforcement, who had literally trained the people who train other officers, standing in a parking lot being questioned about his right to be there. Here was his identification, as legitimate as identification gets in this country, being scrutinized as if it might be an elaborate forgery. And here was an officer whose 12 years of experience should have told him that this situation required nothing more than a polite nod and an apology for the interruption. Yet the encounter continued. If you have ever wondered what invisible barriers still exist in American society, what assumptions still operate beneath the surface of our interactions, this moment captures it perfectly. Let me know in the comments if you have ever experienced something similar, or if you have witnessed someone else go through this kind of scrutiny for simply existing in a space. Hawkins handed the documents back, but he did not step aside. He did not say the words that would have ended this encounter. "Thank you, sir. Sorry to bother you. Have a good day." Instead, he kept his position, his body language suggesting that the interview was not over. "Mind telling me why you're here so early?" Hawkins asked. "Building doesn't open until 8. Jerome accepted his documents and returned them to his wallet with the same deliberate movements. I like to arrive early for client meetings. Gives me time to review my materials, get a sense of the facility. The client contact knows I'm coming. They gave me a code for the side entrance. What kind of training are you doing here? It was a question that served no legitimate law enforcement purpose. There was no crime being investigated. There was no suspicious activity to explain away. There was simply a police officer who had decided that a black man with a federal badge required additional interrogation. But Jerome answered anyway because he understood that this was not really about the questions. This was about power, about control, about an officer who could not bring himself to admit that his instincts had led him astray. Executive protection training, threat assessment, de-escalation techniques, security protocols. The contractor has a team that handles protection details for some of their senior executives when they travel to sensitive locations. And you're qualified to teach that? Something flickered in Jerome's eyes, a brief flash of something that might have been anger or might have been something closer to sadness. He had answered this question in various forms throughout his career, though rarely so directly. The question beneath the question was always the same. How does someone like you have authority like this? I've been a senior instructor with the FBI for 11 years, Jerome said, his voice still level, still controlled. Before that, I spent 11 years as a field agent. I've trained personnel from more than a dozen federal agencies. I've consulted on security protocols for 3 presidential transitions. My qualifications are a matter of public record. Hawkins blinked. The information was landing, but it was landing in a mind that had already reached its conclusions. In psychology, they call this confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs. Derek Hawkins had looked at Jerome Washington and seen something suspicious. Every piece of evidence to the contrary now had to be explained away, reinterpreted, or dismissed. I'm going to need to verify this, Hawkins said. You stay right here. He walked back toward his cruiser, the body camera capturing his retreat and then his return to the vehicle. Inside, he reached for the radio mounted to the dashboard. The conversation that followed would later become a key piece of evidence, replayed in departmental reviews and eventually leaked to the media. It would become a case study in how bias manifests in official communication. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I'm at Meridian Corporate Center, Building 4. I've got a black male, mid-40s, claims to be FBI. He's got what looks like a federal ID, but something's not right here. I need you to run a verification on a Jerome Washington, says he's a senior instructor, and send me backup. There was a pause. When the dispatcher responded, her voice carried a note of confusion that Hawkins either did not notice or chose to ignore. Unit 14, can you clarify the nature of the call? What is the suspicious activity? Hawkins hesitated. It was a reasonable question, and he did not have a reasonable answer. What was Jerome Washington doing that was suspicious? Walking, being early for a meeting, carrying identification that did not match the officer's expectations. He's in the lot before business hours. Just want to make sure everything checks out. Copy Unit 14. Running verification now. Backup is en route. ETA 4 minutes. While Hawkins waited in his cruiser, Jerome Washington stood alone in the parking lot, his briefcase in one hand, his professional obligation suspended, while a patrol officer decided whether to believe that he was who he said he was. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning off some of the mist, warming the air by a few degrees. Birds called from the trees at the lot's edge. A delivery truck rumbled past on the access road. The world continued its ordinary business while Jerome stood still, waiting. Inside his mind, a complicated series of thoughts was running. He was not afraid. Not exactly. He had been in genuinely dangerous situations, had faced armed suspects who had nothing to lose, had made split-second decisions with lives on the line. This was not that. This was something more subtle, more insidious in some ways. This was the weight of assumption, the friction of being seen through a lens that distorted everything it touched. He thought about his father, who had marched in Birmingham in 1963 and had taught his children that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. He thought about his sons, 18 and 20 now, living their own lives, navigating a world that Jerome had hoped would be different by now. He thought about all the officers he had trained over the years, wondering how many of them had carried the same unexamined biases as the man sitting in that cruiser. Mostly, though, he thought about how he was going to handle the next few minutes, because Jerome Washington knew something that Derek Hawkins did not yet understand. He knew that this encounter was being recorded. He knew that his response to it would matter far beyond this parking lot, and he knew that the choices made in moments like this could either perpetuate the cycle of assumption and resentment, or they could demonstrate that there was another way. The backup unit arrived, a second cruiser pulling into the lot and parking alongside Hawkins's vehicle. Two officers emerged, a younger man, perhaps late 20s, with the eager energy of someone still relatively new to the job, and an older woman with sergeant's stripes on her sleeve and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen enough to be cautious about jumping to conclusions. Their names were Officer Michael Torres and Sergeant Patricia Webb. Hawkins stepped out of his cruiser to meet them, and the three officers conferred briefly, their voices too low for Jerome to hear from where he stood. He watched them glance in his direction, watched the younger officer's eyebrows rise at whatever Hawkins was telling him, watched the sergeant's expression remain neutral and unreadable. After a moment, all three began walking toward him. "Sir," Hawkins said as they approached, "these are Officers Torres and Webb. We're just going to verify your credentials, and then you can be on your way." The sergeant said nothing, but her eyes moved over Jerome with a different quality of attention than Hawkins had shown. She was taking in the details, the quality of his suit, the worn familiarity of his briefcase, the way he held himself. Something in her expression suggested she was already skeptical of the premise that this stop was necessary. Torres, the younger officer, seemed uncertain about where to put his hands. He kept shifting them from his belt to his sides and back again, a tell that Jerome recognized from his training experience. This was an officer who had not yet developed confidence in his own judgment, who was looking to his senior colleague for cues about how to behave. Jerome spoke before any of them could continue. His voice carried the same calm authority it had from the beginning, but now there was an additional layer beneath it, something that came from his decades of experience in situations where words mattered as much as actions. "Officers, I understand you have a job to do, and I respect that, but I want to be clear about what's happening here. I am a senior instructor with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have provided proper identification. I have explained my purpose for being here. I have cooperated fully with every request. At this point, I would like to know specifically what suspicious activity has been observed, and I would like a supervisor to be present for any continued interaction." The words hung in the air. Torres glanced at Hawkins. Hawkins's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sergeant Webb, however, nodded slightly. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Webb. I'm the supervisor on scene. Can I see your identification?" Jerome handed over his badge and license once again. Webb examined them with careful attention, turning the badge over, comparing the license photo to the man standing before her. When she looked up, her expression had shifted into something more definite. "Mr. Washington, everything appears to be in order. I apologize for any inconvenience. We'll get out of your way." "Hold on," Hawkins interjected. "Dispatch is still running the verification. We should wait for confirmation." Webb turned to look at her subordinate. Her voice was level, professional, but there was an edge beneath it that suggested she was exercising significant restraint. "Officer Hawkins, the gentleman has provided federal credentials that appear authentic. He's explained his purpose for being here. Unless you have specific, articulable facts that suggest criminal activity, we don't have legal grounds to detain him further. I just want to make sure everything checks out." "Something doesn't feel right." "What specifically doesn't feel right?" Hawkins opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question had exposed the vacuum at the center of his suspicion. He could not articulate what was wrong because nothing was wrong. There was no suspicious behavior. There was no evidence of criminal intent. There was only a black man in a place where Derek Hawkins's unconscious mind had not expected to see one. At that moment, the radio on Webb's shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 14, verification complete. Jerome Washington is confirmed as a senior instructor with the FBI, currently on authorized travel for a training assignment. Dispatch has received a call from the Grayson Defense Solutions contact confirming his appointment this morning." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Torres was staring at his shoes. Webb was looking at Hawkins with an expression that contained multitudes. And Hawkins himself seemed to be experiencing something that his face could not quite process, a collision between what he had believed and what was now undeniably true. Jerome Washington watched all of this. He had been in this position before, in various forms, throughout his life and career. He knew the range of responses that could follow: defensiveness, deflection, grudging acknowledgement, or in the rarest cases, genuine recognition of error. He waited to see which one would emerge. What happened next surprised him. Hawkins took a breath. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, dropped slightly. When he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something that sounded almost uncertain. "Mr. Washington, it seems I may have made an error in judgment. I apologize for any inconvenience." It was not a full acknowledgement. It was not an admission of what had really driven the stop, but it was more than Jerome had expected, more than he had received in some similar situations throughout his career. He nodded, accepting the words at face value while recognizing their limitations. "Officer Hawkins, I appreciate you saying that. I want you to understand something, though. What happened here this morning, this is a teaching moment. I don't say that to lecture you. I say it because teaching is what I do. I have trained thousands of law enforcement officers across this country. I have taught them about threat assessment, about reading situations, about the difference between genuine suspicious behavior and assumptions based on factors that have nothing to do with actual threat indicators. What brought you over to me this morning? What made you decide that I needed to be stopped?" The question sat in the morning air, demanding an answer. Torres and Webb stood silent, watching the exchange. The body camera on Hawkins's chest continued to record, documenting every second. Hawkins swallowed. You were in the lot early, before business hours. I didn't recognize you. And how many other people have you encountered in corporate lots early in the morning without recognizing them?" No answer. "How many of them did you stop and ask for identification?" Still no answer. The silence itself was an answer. Jerome continued, his voice still measured, still without anger, but carrying the weight of something important. "I am not going to file a complaint about what happened here. I want you to know that. But I am going to ask you to do something. I want you to think about this interaction. I want you to think about what made you decide I was suspicious. I want you to think about whether you would have made the same decision if I looked different. And then I want you to ask yourself how many times you might have made similar decisions without even being aware of it." He paused, looking at each of the officers in turn. "The work you do matters. Law enforcement matters. Community trust matters. And every interaction either builds that trust or erodes it. Today, you have a chance to learn something that could make you better at your job. Whether you take that chance is up to you." Jerome checked his watch. It was 8:17. He was still ahead of schedule, but the morning had taken on a weight that would not easily dissipate. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a training session to conduct." He turned and walked toward Building 4, his stride unhurried, his posture unchanged. Behind him, 3 officers stood in various states of reflection. The body camera continued to record as Jerome Washington disappeared through the glass doors of the building. What happened next unfolded over days and weeks, a slow cascade of consequences that would touch everyone involved. Let me walk you through it, because the immediate encounter was only the beginning of this story. Inside Building 4, Jerome Washington conducted his training session as planned. He spoke about threat assessment. He spoke about de-escalation. He spoke about reading body language and recognizing genuine warning signs. At one point, during a section on implicit bias in security settings, he paused and shared what had happened to him less than an hour earlier. He did not name the officers. He did not express anger. He simply described the encounter as a case study, asking the participants to analyze it the way they would analyze any other scenario. What factors contributed to the interaction? What assumptions were at play? How might it have been handled differently? The room was quiet when he finished. These were security professionals, people who understood the complexities of their work. Several of them nodded. A few took notes. One participant, a former police officer herself, raised her hand and shared a similar experience from her own career. The conversation that followed was honest, difficult, and productive in ways that few such conversations managed to be. Meanwhile, back at the Fairview Police Department, other conversations were beginning. Sergeant Webb had filed a report about the incident, as she was required to do. Her account was factual and restrained, but the facts themselves were damning enough. An officer had stopped a federal law enforcement instructor based on no articulable suspicious behavior. The stop had been recorded. The department's body camera footage was automatically uploaded to a cloud server at the end of each shift, where it became part of the official record. The body camera footage from Officer Derek Hawkins sat in that system for 3 days before anyone beyond the immediate chain of command saw it. During those 3 days, an internal review was initiated. Hawkins was called in to provide a statement. He described the encounter in terms that emphasized his caution, his concern for security, his commitment to protecting the corporate park he patrolled. When asked directly why he had found Jerome Washington suspicious, he could not provide a concrete answer. On the 4th day, someone leaked the footage. It appeared first on a local news site, uploaded by an anonymous source with a brief description. Fairview Police Stop FBI Instructor. Within hours, it had spread to regional news outlets. By the end of the day, it was on national networks. The footage was not dramatic in the way that some police videos are. There was no violence, no shouting, no obvious confrontation. What made it powerful was its quiet devastation, the sight of a man who had spent his career training law enforcement being treated as a suspect for walking through a parking lot. The internet response was swift and divided, as internet responses always are. Some viewers focused on Jerome Washington's composure, praising his handling of the situation, sharing his words about teaching moments and community trust. Others focused on Derek Hawkins, questioning his judgment, his training, his fitness for the badge he wore. Still others tried to defend the officer, arguing that he was just doing his job, that you could never be too careful, that the situation could have been different if Jerome had been who Hawkins feared he might be. The Fairview Police Department issued a statement on the 5th day. It was the kind of statement that institutions issue when they are trying to acknowledge a problem without fully confronting it. They expressed confidence in their officers while acknowledging that the incident was under review. They mentioned their commitment to community policing and their ongoing efforts to address bias in law enforcement. They said nothing specific about what would happen to Officer Hawkins. Jerome Washington declined requests for media interviews. He had not sought attention, and he did not want to become a symbol or a spokesperson. When a reporter managed to reach him by phone, he said only that he hoped the incident would prompt genuine reflection rather than mere performance. He hoped people would think carefully about the assumptions they carried and the impact those assumptions could have. Then he returned to his work, teaching the next session on his schedule, preparing for the next assignment. But the story did not end there. Stories like this rarely end with a single statement and a return to normal. Within the Fairview Police Department, the incident had exposed fault lines that had existed for years. Other officers began talking, some off the record, some to union representatives, some to investigators who were now taking a closer look at patterns of stops and complaints. Derek Hawkins's history came under scrutiny in a way it never had before. Those 5 previous complaints, each one closed without action, were reviewed again in the light of this new incident. Patterns emerged, questions were raised, the comfortable assumptions that had allowed those complaints to be dismissed no longer seemed quite so comfortable. 2 weeks after the parking lot encounter, Derek Hawkins was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the internal investigation. The official reason was standard procedure, the same kind of leave that any officer might receive while a serious complaint was being evaluated, but everyone understood the real reason. The footage had made it impossible to look away. 3 weeks after that, the investigation concluded. Its findings were not made public in full, but the key conclusions were summarized in a department press release. Officer Hawkins had acted without sufficient justification. His decision to initiate a stop had been based on factors that did not constitute reasonable suspicion under department policy or constitutional standards. His characterization of the subject as suspicious was not supported by any observable behavior. The investigation also noted patterns in his previous stops that warranted further review. Derek Hawkins resigned from the Fairview Police Department on a Tuesday afternoon. 6 weeks after the encounter in the parking lot, he submitted his resignation letter and cleaned out his locker without speaking to colleagues. His union representative issued a statement saying that Officer Hawkins believed he had acted appropriately, but felt that the publicity surrounding the incident made it impossible for him to continue serving effectively. The statement stopped short of apology or acknowledgement. It was the kind of statement that allows someone to walk away without having to confront what they have done. This brings me to a question I want to ask you, and I genuinely want you to think about it before you answer in the comments. What do you think should happen to someone like Derek Hawkins? Is resignation enough? Should there be legal consequences? Should there be a path to redemption and return? There are no easy answers here. The person who made that stop in the parking lot was not a monster. He was a man who had served for 12 years, who had never committed violence, who believed he was doing his job. And yet the pattern of his decisions, the shape of his assumptions, had caused real harm to real people. What does accountability look like in a case like this? Let me tell you what happened after the resignation, because the ripples from that Wednesday morning continued to spread long after Derek Hawkins turned in his badge. The Fairview Police Department, under pressure from community groups and local officials, announced a series of reforms. They would implement new training on implicit bias, with sessions conducted quarterly rather than the previous annual requirement. They would establish a new review process for complaints involving allegations of racial profiling, with outside civilian oversight for cases that revealed patterns of concerning behavior. They would require officers to document specific, articulable facts justifying any stop, with supervisors reviewing these justifications within 24 hours. These were not revolutionary changes. Many departments had implemented similar measures before, but for Fairview, they represented an acknowledgement that something had been wrong and needed to be fixed. The body camera footage became a training tool, not just in Fairview, but in departments across the region and eventually across the country. It was included in curricula developed by the State Police Academy. It was featured in a documentary about policing and race that aired on a major streaming platform. It was analyzed in academic papers about implicit bias and the gap between intention and impact. The 47 seconds that had changed Derek Hawkins' career became 47 seconds that countless other officers would watch and discuss, trying to understand where the decision to stop Jerome Washington had come from and how they could avoid making similar decisions themselves. Jerome Washington continued his work. In the months following the incident, he noticed that his sessions on bias and assumption drew larger audiences than before. Officers who might once have dismissed such topics as politically correct pandering now seemed genuinely engaged, asking questions, sharing their own experiences, wrestling with the complexities of the work they did. He could not know how much of this was genuine shift and how much was performance, but he chose to believe that at least some of it was real. He had spent too many years in this work to become cynical about the possibility of change. One afternoon, about 4 months after the parking lot encounter, Jerome received an unexpected email. It was from Derek Hawkins. The message was brief, awkward in places, clearly the product of significant effort and uncertainty. It said that Hawkins had been thinking a lot about what had happened that morning. It said that he had been doing some reading, talking to some people, trying to understand things he had never examined before. It said that he did not expect forgiveness, but he wanted Jerome to know that the words spoken in the parking lot about teaching moments and asking hard questions had stayed with him. He was trying. He did not know if he was succeeding, but he was trying. Jerome read the email twice. He thought about responding immediately, then decided to wait. When he did respond 3 days later, he kept it simple. He thanked Hawkins for reaching out. He said that the work of examining our assumptions was never finished, that it was something everyone had to do continuously throughout their lives. He wished him well. He did not say that all was forgiven because forgiveness was not his to give, but he left the door open to the possibility that people could change. Whether Derek Hawkins actually changed, whether his examination of himself led to genuine transformation or faded back into comfortable old patterns, Jerome would never know. That is the nature of these stories. We see the moments that are captured on camera, the encounters that make the news. We do not see the slow internal work that happens afterward, if it happens at all. We are left to wonder. What we can say with certainty is this. A Wednesday morning that should have been unremarkable became something else entirely. A man walking to a meeting was stopped for no legitimate reason. His response to that stop, his composure and clarity, turned a potential confrontation into something more complicated and ultimately more useful. An officer's career ended not because of a single mistake, but because that mistake revealed a pattern he had never been forced to confront. A department was pushed to examine its practices. A community began a conversation it had been avoiding. And somewhere in all of this, the body camera kept rolling. That small device attached to Derek Hawkins' uniform captured what human memory might have distorted or denied. It created a record that could not be argued with, a truth that could not be negotiated away. In an era when so many of our conflicts come down to competing narratives, each side insisting on its own version of events, the camera offered something rare, a shared point of reference. People could argue about what the footage meant, about what should happen as a result, about who deserved sympathy and who deserved blame, but they could not argue about what had happened. They could watch it for themselves. This is the power and the limitation of video evidence in our time. It shows us what occurred, but it cannot tell us why. It captures actions, but not the thoughts and assumptions that drive them. It creates accountability, but not understanding. The real work of understanding, of grappling with the biases we carry and the harm they can cause, that work has to happen in places no camera can reach. I want to close with something Jerome Washington said during a training session several months after the incident. He was asked by a young officer what advice he would give to someone just starting out in law enforcement, someone who wanted to do the job right without falling into the traps that had ended careers like Derek Hawkins's. Jerome thought for a moment before answering. "Every person you encounter is a full human being," he said. "They have a history you don't know. They have fears and hopes and people who love them. They have reasons for being where they are and doing what they're doing that you probably can't guess. Your job is to protect them, all of them, including from yourself, including from your own assumptions about who they are and what they might do. The moment you start seeing categories instead of individuals, the moment you let your gut override your training, you become dangerous. Not because you're a bad person, but because you have power, and power without awareness is the most dangerous thing there is." He paused, letting the words settle. "You're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. The question is what you do with them. Do you defend them, explain them away, convince yourself you were right all along? Or do you let them teach you something? Do you let them make you better? That's the choice you'll face over and over throughout your career. What you choose will determine what kind of officer you become." The room was silent. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Questions followed. Conversations began that would continue long after the session ended. And somewhere in Virginia, in a corporate parking lot that looked like 1,000 other corporate parking lots, the morning light fell on empty asphalt. The spot where Jerome Washington had stood was just a spot now, unmarked and unremarkable. But what had happened there had left a trace that would persist long after the last echo of that Wednesday morning faded away. If this story made you think, if it raised questions you want to explore further, I ask you to subscribe and join this community. We tell stories here that matter, stories that challenge us to look more closely at the world and at ourselves. Leave a comment telling me what you took away from this one. Tell me whether you think the system worked or failed or something in between. Tell me what you think real accountability looks like. And come back tomorrow because there is always another story waiting to be told. This is the work we do together, trying to understand a world that is never as simple as we want it to be.